Hey everybody, welcome back to Backlog Banter. I'm your boy Abram, joined as always by Tucker Hazel, and we are here today to talk about PlayStation. And we're here to do it from somewhat of a high level and somewhat of a low level, because just yesterday we watched the new PlayStation State of Play event, and it sort of paints an interesting picture for not only what's next for PlayStation this year, but kind of where PlayStation Studios is going in general, moving forward through the rest of the generation. And obviously, Mr. Tucker Hazel here is very, very passionate about this point in PlayStation history.
Yeah.
I tried to get another P word in there, but I couldn't think of one.
Well, I'm passionate about whatever moment in PlayStation history I'm currently in. And also all the other points as well. So it's kind of just like a general... You can't take it out of the person or whatever. You can't take the PlayStation hype away out of the Tucker Hazel, but you can... Whatever, you can get the joke.
Tucker, you did a video that's about an hour and a half long with Botox Games recently, talking about sort of what was riding on the PlayStation event that's now happened, sort of how we set this a larger inflection point for the PS5, for PlayStation Studios, and we sort of have somewhat of a clearer picture of those next steps now coming out of yesterday's event. Yeah. So sort of hit me with how you feel about where PlayStation Studios is going and how I think this year, and I know you do too, how you also think this year reflects sort of an inflection point from where we were in that first half of the generation.
Yeah, I think that the picture that was painted by this state of play that happened yesterday at the time of recording, probably as of uploading, I'll probably put this up tonight, it isn't an insane change when you're thinking of it on just the level of, okay, they announced 2 games, they're coming out later this year, people are maybe excited for one, they're maybe not excited for the other. But when you really take a sort of macro level view at Sony's 2024 as a whole, what these 2 games, Astro and Concord, mean in combination with other rumored games, with the projects that have been gestating in the background for a long time, and also with the games that have already come out this year from PlayStation published games, those being Helldivers II, Stellar Blade, Rise of the Ronin. And of course, they always have MLB, but it's kind of just a wash. I think that it is pretty exciting because one of the major things we talked about in that long PlayStation-focused video, and what many people have been talking about for the entirety of the generation for PS5 so far, is that PS5 doesn't really have an identity. It feels like PS4 too. There are 2 jokes that every game that they put out is a sequel to a PlayStation 4 game. It's God of War 2, it's Horizon 2, it's Spider-Man 2, it's Ratchet 2. Frankly, that's almost every game they've put out this generation.
Yeah.
And the other joke is that PlayStation 5 has no games. And I think they're both pretty accurate. I mean, I like my PlayStation 5, but I have some serious issues with it in terms of the lineup coming from PlayStation Studios. And the lack of identity, I think, is the biggest one for me because, Spider-Man 2 and God of War Ragnarok are 2 of my favorite games ever. I think they're 2 of the best games ever made. But they're not particularly fresh. And I knew that I was going to like them going in because I liked the other games that happened before. And so looking at the fact that PlayStation 5 has been lacking its own identity for 3.5 years into its life cycle, and then looking at 2024, I think this is a pretty solid inflection point, actually. Because before this, 1, 2, maybe 3 if we're lucky. Games a year, mostly an established IP that are direct sequels to something happened before. But we are... by the end of this year, we will have 5 new games from Sony that are... One of them is a sequel. Helldivers 2 is a sequel. But it's also kind of not a sequel in terms of it looks very different from Helldivers. We will have 5 games that are totally different from what anything that Sony put out in the PlayStation 4 generation. And multiple new IP that we hadn't seen almost any of up to this point. And so I think that this is really exciting. Almost none of the games coming out this year are based on things that happened before. Almost all of them are totally different gameplay styles. Both of the games that were announced yesterday and upcoming are very different gameplay styles from teams that we haven't seen major releases from before. Both of these are totally new in that area. And so I think that this is actually really, really exciting as a point of change, not in, we're getting the next major IP from them. This isn't them doing Horizon and Ghost like they did at the end of PS4, but Concord and Astro and Stellar Blade and Helldivers 2 and PC releases. This is PS5's identity starting to finally show itself. And I think that's really, really exciting.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting, right? Because as we said in a failed recording that we are now reworking today,
Sigh. Technology. We needed Astro in there. He would have. It was probably a bunch of little gremlin guys that he could have beat up.
yeah, Astra would have intervened and not let the recording fail yesterday. But it's interesting to even tackle the idea of PlayStation's identity because I was reflecting back in the PS4 generation this morning a little bit.
Yeah.
And the games that we talk about defining it are not really the games that defined the entirety of the PS4's life.
Oh, yeah. They were all pretty late, all things considered.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about Horizon in 2017, or you think about Uncharted 4 really in 2016, into Horizon, into God of War, Spider-Man, Ghost, Last of Us Part 2.
Yeah.
That was really a movement that didn't begin at the start of the PS4 generation. And even through those years, PS4 had a lot of fairly interesting software. You get things like The Last Guardian, you get small games like Everybody's Gone to the Golf Course or whatever it is.
You mashed together 2 games, but we get what you're saying.
I think that, PlayStation, for as varied as PS4 was in its exclusive catalog, all things considered, it did rise to the top what seemed like a direction for PlayStation.
Definitely.
Not necessarily an identity for PS4, but I think just sort of a happenstance movement that began on PS4 because that's when the games are ready.
Sure.
Because, the games you're talking about in the first half generation are part of this larger, hyper cinematic movement. This cinematic, mature, story-led, third-person action.
Last of Us-esque.
Identity. Yeah. And I think we're at this inflection point that you're discussing here for a number of reasons, and I think a lot of them are practical. I think that, as we've seen in Insomniac's tenuous financial position, despite them being so prolific, looking at people like Sean Layden coming out and talking about how inordinate the production cycles for PlayStation's games are getting.
Definitely.
I think we're starting to see the fruits of a necessary change.
Yeah. And I think a pretty exciting one. And probably a healthier one as well.
Yeah, so I question whether we can look at all these games coming out now and sort of draw a particular console-focused identity out of them. I feel like if anything, you have to kind of draw it by absence, by these games not being what these games were. But by that merit, these not big cinematic third-person action games are largely so different that we're now dealing with, again, an era of variety.
Yeah.
Which... Again, I think PS4 had for a long time. Yeah. It just got subsumed by the games that rose to the top. And so I think that PlayStation Studios is now kind of hard to intuit because so much of what we're getting is from new teams. Concord is from a new dev team. Sony, for as much as people do want to say that they have a different philosophy to Xbox, and they do, there's no doubt that a lot of the injections of new games are coming from a Microsoft style, let's go and buy things angle. Whether that is buying studios or buying exclusivity to particular titles, a long-standing idea, but now a more prevalent one, I would say, in terms of... Well, that might not be true because like PS1, PS2 is a lot of bought exclusives. But the point is, I like this grab bag approach from Sony. Definitely. I'm just a little bit, I'm not going to say skeptical, but I would say just intrigued to learn if this is going to then reduce itself back down into a PlayStation feel again.
Yeah, that's what's going to be really interesting to see because I think that you're right. It's such a hard shift from one game last year being Spider-Man 2, which is very much in the exact vein that we were talking about, to none of those this year, and a bunch of other things from external teams, from the first Korean team that PlayStation worked with, from Arrowhead, who had been making this one game for 10 years, from the first time that Team Asobi and Firewalk are going to be having full console releases. This is all just like stuff that's kind of all hitting at once, and I think that the balance will become clear as the generation progresses, because a lot of the things that we were talking about in that bigger video that I talked about with Bo is that all of the PlayStation Studios teams that we know so well and enjoy the games of are working on things that will be hitting before the end of the generation. And whether that is continuing sequels to things like something like a Horizon 3 or a Spider-Man 3, which are games that are certainly in development, or new IP from these bigger studios like a new Naughty Dog IP or Santa Monica IP, or Bend or Blue Point. There is a lot of interesting new stuff coming. But
Yeah.
we are in the point where those aren't ready yet, and so they're using the scattershot, grab bag, different sources of games approach to make, I think, a pretty compelling lineup for this year
Yeah.
in those games that I mentioned. Of course, on top of that, there are things like Last of Us Part 2 Remastered and Until Dawn getting a remake. So they actually have quite a bit of stuff this year. But I do think that it does signal some changes for me that I think will prevent, even if we are still seeing Spider-Man 3s and Horizon 3s, from those being the only things that the rest of the generation has, in that things like investing in external devs like Shift Up, or acquiring IP like Rise of Ronin, or letting Arrowhead cook in the background for all this time. I think that is I think it has worked out really well for them in all of those cases. And I think that's something that will continue forward. And I think you can pretty clearly see that in the investment that they've made in other external development teams from countries that they haven't historically worked with, in the Chinese, Indian, and African hero projects. They will be publishing a lot of totally externally developed, totally new IP games that will be balancing out, much like Stellar Blade was this year, what the traditional studios are doing. And we have teams like Firewalk and Haven and Bluepoint that haven't put out PlayStation Studios games yet. Concord is on the way. That will be shifting the identity of what PlayStation Studios is as an entire conglomerate, rather than just thinking of Guerrilla, Sucker Punch, Santa Monica, Naughty Dog. There is a larger family here that is finally starting to show its face. And I think that is what's really exciting to me, is maybe it's not, okay, we are completely hard shifting, but that it's becoming more diverse in a way that I think is, especially someone like you would look at the first half of PS5's life cycle and be like, there's not really a lot for me being talking as you. And if they start doing more Astro style things, and Team Asobi puts out one or two more games over the course of generation, and we get some interesting games from African and Indian and Chinese studios that maybe appeal to you a little bit more, and maybe we get a little bit more like digital only titles, that diversification I think will allow a lot wider breadth of people into Sony's internal studios or published games world.
Yeah, and I just think it's important because, there's little chance of a team like Naughty Dog being put on a faster treadmill. I think it's very unlikely that PlayStation would be able to exercise a sort of top-down control over Naughty Dog or Santa Monica and say, look, you have now just this much time to make the game. So I think that's unlikely. But you look at a team like Team Asobi, and we can presume that Astro Bot started development probably in 2020, let's say 2021, or pre-production in 2020, whatever. This game is probably staring down the barrel of like a 3 to 3.5 year development cycle, which is a lot more reasonable than the cycles that most of PlayStation teams are working on right now. So I think that what PlayStation is basically setting up nicely is this idea that surrounding their big games, surrounding their big Sucker Punch titles and Santa Monica titles and Naughty Dog titles are going to be games that are just made more effectively. Whether, to your point, they are projects from these various regional hero projects where they're giving funding and giving support, but really primarily publishing, to setting up teams like Asobi to make leaner projects.
Definitely,
I think that the issue with PlayStation is not that they decided to focus on this like big cinematic tentpole experience, is that they kind of did that at the cost of working across scale.
Definitely, and you can absolutely look at that when you, or you can notice that when you look at the games that they published in the middle of the PS4 generation to the end of the PS4 generation into PS5, where we completely lost the Gravity Rush 2, Knack, Drawn to Death, Bound, Erica. They did a lot of weird-ass shit in 2015, 2016, 2017. But by the point where you hit 2018, 2019, it really is just God of War, Detroit, Spider-Man, Death Stranding, Days Gone. They lose that entirely, and I think it was a resources thing. It's like, look, these are the things that have worked for us. Horizon, big IP off the start. Naughty Dog continues to kill it. I assume the mindset was, let's focus our energy on what works, but I think they're realizing that there is a value in variety.
Yeah.
And I think that one very key place that we seem to be noticing a change is in making games that can appeal to younger players, which is something they did, I think, pretty solidly in PS4, but have lacked almost entirely during PS5. In Astro's Playroom, a big scope, but very family-friendly game that is a big part of their schedule. And frankly, the game that but mostly people like us, are going to enjoy most from their staple of games. And also the currently rumored Lego Horizon game. Horizon, a big, mature, cinematic open-world experience. But if you can rework that into something that is more family-friendly and accessible, suddenly PlayStation has a depth and accessibility for a wider range of players that I think is really important, because I can't even really imagine being a 8-year-old and wanting to ask for a PS5 unless I want to play Fortnite or Roblox or something that my friends are playing.
Or Sackboy's Big Adventure.
Or Sackboy, yeah, but that completely went by the wayside. Because their titles were specific things. Being 8 years old and wanting to play Horizon or God of War Ragnarok, I mean, you probably want to play Spider-Man, because Spider-Man's just an all ages kind of thing. But I think it's important what they seem to be signaling a change of. We need to reach out to different kind of gamers. We need to diversify, especially the gameplay style of the IPs that we are publishing and developing. This year is just full of a bunch of different weirdo things.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about Concord. I know you. I mean, I know you've been thinking about Concord a lot. As of the time this video posts, people can go watch your video about why you're hyped for Concord.
Let's check in. It's at 57% uploaded as of what we're talking. Let's go.
I think.
But you've been thinking about it as well.
I have been, and Concord is interesting for me because this game has presumably been in development for a long time.
Yeah, I think it started in 2019.
Right. So what's interesting about Concord is that in some ways Concord is actually the antithesis of Astro. Mm-hmm. In some ways it's similar, in some ways it's quite different. Mm-hmm. I wonder if it was a mistake to let them work on that game for this long.
Sure. Yeah.
I'd be curious to know what the budget of Concord was. Mm-hmm. And I'd be curious to know if Concord really addresses the production side issues PlayStation has as nicely as it addresses the sort of gameplay side issues it has.
Yeah.
And I wonder that same question about Helldivers also.
Yeah, sure.
Because, a game like Helldivers perhaps doesn't look and feel as AAA as these marquee PlayStation games we're talking about, but it no doubt was in development for the time of one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it no doubt took a lot of resources to polish that game to where it is.
Yeah.
And Concord, say whatever you will about it, and I'm sure we'll say various things in this video, it is a very high fidelity project.
Oh, totally, yeah. Yeah, especially in the cinematics.
It makes me wonder if this game is actually super indicative of where PlayStation wants to move or not. I feel like it is in some ways of it being this live service, evolving game, this taking of PlayStation into a new genre space. But it's also probably a game that probably wasn't developed very efficiently. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if we're going to end up seeing, because there's a wider breadth of PlayStation Studios now, a consistent clip of games because there's just more people working, or if there will be any of these newer studios put on a tighter leash the way that it seems like Asobi is.
Yeah, maybe. I think that the idea... I think that the reason I don't necessarily think it's fair to make the same kind of direct comparison between those two teams is that they are ultimately making very different types of projects. And even though Astro Bot, the upcoming game, is a very high resolution game and the textures look very good, it is something that is able to be developed on a smaller timescale and budget simply by the fact that it's not hyper realistic and there is no motion capture, and you don't need to worry about the facial animation and things like that are really what ends up contributing to the insane budgets. It's attention to detail that really is what is causing games to take longer to make, and you want to make sure that the eyelashes look right and that the shadows cast right, and that the environmental detail in rock terrain is up to a surpassing the bar that it was at before. And Astro, it looks great, but it doesn't need to obtain those, and Concord kind of does. But Concord also, I think, I don't necessarily worry about it in the same way of, yeah, you're right, it's probably one of the bigger budget this kind of games that has been made.
Yeah.
But because it does look high production value.
Looks very good.
But it also, for PlayStation, I think that they see that as a risk worth taking or worth trying to change the direction of where their resources are going versus the fact that they've been doing just single player massive budget games, because Concord has the ability to be a long tail live service microtransaction-y thing that is keeping players retained. It has the possibility to do that. Who knows if it will do that in the way that none of their other games really have. And so I think that it's the not putting all your eggs in one basket thing that I think is really apparent here. Is we've still got Sucker Punch and Santa Monica and Naughty Dog working in the background, presumably on these massive things, but having Asobi working at a smaller clip, and then Haven and Firewalk working on multiplayer things that can be pulling in player retention and microtransaction money over a longer period of time. I think it's just like they're trying to diversify their income streams. They're working on adapting God of War and Horizon and Last of Us and Twisted Metal into TV and film. They're just trying a bunch of different things, and I think it will eventually balance out to where, like, oh, I feel the synergy between these. But at the moment, we're like, oh, okay, so they're publishing a Korean game, and Arrowhead's been working on this for 10 years, and we just got out Spider-Man 2, and Concord is a new team, but also it's been in development for a long time. And Astro is so it's like a fan of like different avenues where resources at different scales are being given. But I think that diversification is, again, where I feel the change in identity, especially versus the last 3 years, which have just been outside of, I guess, like Housemarque. But even Housemarque is with Returnal was fitting more into the mold of what the other studios were doing with Returnal versus their previous projects, versus just doing Spider-Man, God of War, Horizon, which is what the entire first half of this generation was.
Yeah, I think you're right. I guess I'm just interested in whether Sony's going to look back on Concord and think that was smart or not.
If no one plays it, absolutely they won't.
Because I was thinking about it in relationship to Fair Games.
Yeah.
Because they're in an interesting position, right, where Astro stands by itself, right? Mm-hmm. And even when Sony is releasing a number of these single-player titles, quote-unquote, against each other, they're not in competition the same way that Concord and Fair Games are going to be now. And we've been talking a lot in our Discord server and just generally over the past evening about how Concord has a very aggressive post-release strategy in place.
Current plan, yeah.
And so it'll be curious to see what the gap between day one for Concord is and day one for Fair Games will be, and whether there's going to be an overlap there, or if there's almost a predetermined kill date for new content for Concord to clear the path for Fair Games, because you don't really have a ton of examples of big publishers trying to compete against themselves with these sorts of games.
That's a good point, yeah.
Those examples like that do exist, and it did exist more when Destiny was an Activision product, and that's going up against COD. There was an issue there. Yeah. And obviously, I think that's part of why the relationship between Bungie and Activision fell apart.
Sure, yeah.
And so it just makes me wonder if we're seeing an inflection point now that's going to, again, change when more pieces fall into place, and games like Concord end up feeling like these odd growing pains when they're still trying to figure out exactly what to do here. Yeah,
I think it's definitely possible, and I hadn't really thought about it from that angle. My assumption is that Fair Games is a year away. I think that's a next summer title, and I think a year is enough space for Concord, for PlayStation and Firewalk to know if Concord is going to be something that they should even bother putting.
I think they'll know within 3 months.
Well, of course, yes, but by a year, it'll be completely clear. And so. Also, just knowing how quickly people move on from these kind of games, the pool of live service multiplayer games that stick around does grow, because we've seen a larger number of them be stickier and be supported over a long period of time as more of them have released, and certain ones have become popular. But also, those are obviously not the majority of games that are in this style that are put out. And so I think that they probably realize they're putting what they can into this. But even though I'm very excited for the game, I think that there is a pretty realistic view in that they probably think that a year of really, really solid hard support on Concord is about as much as is worth it. And then maybe another 18 months, 2 years after that of less support, developing that next project, letting it sort of coast out. I think that that's probably the plan. And so I think a year apart, you're right, it is competition in a way that we don't really see a lot of publishers do for themselves. But I don't think it's a massive issue, but it'll be interesting to see because then, I mean, Jade Raymond's produced some of the stickiest IP that have ever been had. And so if Haven is really, really hard at work on Fair Games, and that's the one that hits, then I agree that Concord will probably look in retrospect like a Growing Pains thing of like, oh, you remember the first time they did like a new IP live service thing and then nobody really played it? But then Fair Games, but also maybe Fair Games doesn't work. Like, there's just so many questions.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I would err on the side of neither working, but that's a different conversation. I also don't think that
I think it is the same conversation in terms of where the resources are going. If even someone like you, who these are games that are in a type of genre that you have enjoyed
I play a lot of shooters,
significantly, But if you are Mr. Joe Schmo who edits a fucking book, if you're saying like, I don't think either of these are going to work, who knows what they're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Chris Reagan who made this point on a podcast, and probably it was obviously on Sacred Symbols at some point in the past, talking about like how you don't even does a multiplayer shooter need to be a live service? Mm-hmm. And I think that's it. I think that's actually an astute point in that there was.
Are there any examples in the modern era where they're not?
Not really. I think you'd have to be going back to like the era of things like Titanfall 2 and going back to the era of Battlefield 1 and looking at what COD was before COD became this just disastrously large launcher where all the games are in this contiguous experience or whatever. But I don't think it's actually a bad idea for if you could unify PlayStation's games for the most part around an overarching emphasis on storytelling. Mm-hmm. If Firewalk said, hey, we plan to tell a story in the universe of Concord that's going to take us about 9 months to tell. During that time, you're going to get all of this new content. You're going to go from a really full day one package to an overstuffed day like 120 package, and then we're going to be done. The game will live on. You can keep playing the multiplayer, but we're going to move on. I don't think that's a bad idea. I mean, that's how shooters were made for a very, very long time. And so I think that that's a possibility. Yeah. But I also think that, PlayStation knows that the goal right now is to try to sledgehammer down that live service door and get your title through. So so I don't think that's what they're going to do. But at the same time, for as much as we've been going back and forth about the role of story in this game, the potential of this game, I don't necessarily think that Firewalk has yet done enough to illustrate particularly what it means for Concord to be this story heavy, what it means for this game post-release. And I think the reason I drill in on that is just because they've opted to have such a surprisingly short proper reveal to release window. Yeah. And it just makes me feel like maybe there's not this more unique plan that I might hope that there would be. Sure. And this might be more traditional in how it rolls out, and it might just be unceremoniously met with death. I certainly hope not, because for as skeptical as I am about the game, I do really think that it does look good. Yeah. I was watching a trailer again today. I think the art direction is really good. I think the influence of Destiny is very obvious here, which I don't think is a problem because Destiny, the Crucible, plays phenomenally. So I think the game will be fun. I just think that there's a lot more considerations for a title like this than sort of intrinsic artistic quality.
Sure.
So.
No, that's totally true. And that is, I think, why it makes this game and also the surprise hit of Helldivers 2 so interesting as a current part of the evolving PlayStation Studios, because PlayStation Studios is evolving quite significantly right now. Not only are there They acquired a bunch of teams that had not made games before in the early 2020s, which they had not done ever previously to that, and those games are going to be coming out over the course of the next few years. Concord being the first one, but also there's a leadership change that has happened, and a leadership change to two people, and also PlayStation Productions is now a growing quickly part of their ecosystem and identity, and so I think that it's just a lot. It's sort of fan approach that I was talking about earlier. It's like there's a lot of new elements of identity that are currently being started here, and who the hell knows if they can properly manage the post-launch support of a major live service game? I don't know. I mean, currently Arrowhead is scrambling to be like, oh God, we need to support this for a long time because people like it, and they certainly didn't think that it was going to be as big as it is, and Sony certainly didn't because they didn't market the game commensurate to its success pool. But Concord will be the testing grounds, but it's really for me a wait and see sort of thing. I can't say one way or another if they will be able to handle this or not. I can't say if people will glom onto this game or not, because I think you can read it from a couple directions. I think you can read it from Sony clearly saw something in this, and they have a pretty good eye in terms of the large scope of things. They don't usually put out bad games, and they seem to know where quality lies. And the dev members behind this are ex-Bungie people, and so they know what makes a game like this. And so you can read it from a hopeful side of, if ex-Bungie and PlayStation Productions are thinking that this is going to be a big thing, and they're able to market it with Sony's money in the way that many of these other failed live service games, they never have the chance to because they don't have a major publisher unless it's EA with Apex or Epic with Fortnite or something like that. Maybe it can be a big success. Maybe there is something here that we can't see yet because something like this hasn't happened from them yet. But you could also easily read the other side of it's still, no matter the dev history, no matter the publishing track record, no matter the marketing budget going into it, it's still a live service game, and a lot of these
could still be Lawbreakers.
It could still be Battleborn. It could still be Lawbreakers. Absolutely, and both are possible roads right now, because also, Abram, we are less than one day from this game being actually revealed. So and I also think that we will get a better idea of what the structure of the game is, what the support of this game is, what the effort going into it is, as over the next 3 months we get more information, and then people get their hands on it with the beta, and then the game actually launches, and then we see what that actually means in terms of them putting in weekly cinematics. But I think it's a really, really interesting game, not only because I think it looks good and I'm excited for it, but because it is something very, very, very different. Not only because it's a live service game, which they've done a couple of, but not to this kind, but also because it's a first-person shooter, and Sony doesn't do first-person shooters. And people have been long saying, you want to compete with Call of Duty? Because there was a big thing during the FTC trials for the Activision Blizzard Xbox merger or acquisition of Sony being like, if we lose COD, it's over. Like, we need Call of Duty on our platform. It's a massive thing. Yeah. And because they had basically stopped trying it all because they'd had a Call of Duty on their platform, people were like, well, you maybe should put some effort into making a Call of Duty competitor in-house. And Concord is that. But I feel like people don't realize that it is. It's a first-person. Yeah. It's the first first-person shooter that they've developed from one of their internal studios in over a decade. And so...
since Killzone, right?
Shadowfall, yeah. I think that was the last one. Yeah.
I would just like to see this game have a story mode, and I don't think it's going to. And at a certain point, it is what it is. That wasn't their intent. That wasn't the design doc, and I get that. I would just like to see, as largely a sidebar, but I would just like to see Sony apply its storytelling approach and level of fidelity to a single-player FPS. I think that could be really good.
Do you think I don't want that? Are you fucking kidding me? I would drop this game being an Overwatch style, which I loved Overwatch. I would drop this game being an Overwatch style game, and even though how much I could get into this, I would drop that in less than a nanosecond. If this means that we got a funny adventure first person shooter game, like if this was like PlayStation's Wolfenstein, that'd be the best game I've ever played in my life.
And I realize what I'm about to say is there's a no duh answer to this, but I was kind of hoping for Concord to maybe be PlayStation's Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. obviously their Indiana Jones the Great Circle is Uncharted, but what I'm saying
No,
is
their Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is going to be Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, and that eventually hits PlayStation 5 like 6 months later.
You're probably right. But I just think that a game like Concord, because I think that the world looks quite rich. I just wish that they would at least tie this to something that is more traditionally PlayStation,
Sure,
or traditionally modern PlayStation.
Yeah.
But Astro is another really interesting one, because I think you make a good point about the sort of family friendly appeal.
Yeah.
Although I also, whether this has basis in reality or not, I feel like I need to research and find some numbers about. But I almost
that's never
feel
stopped
like
you from saying stuff before.
Yeah, I almost feel like that's not super important.
Okay.
Like, kids in middle school are just playing Fortnite.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't think that there is a huge like jump from playing Fortnite to playing like Horizon, and so I think the Lego Horizon is a fairly good idea.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know if Astro necessarily services a younger audience. I mean, it does on a literal level, in that it is going to be, if Playroom's any indication, I think it very clearly is. It'll be a very simple couple button 3D platformer, but to me, it doesn't strike me as a kid's game. It strikes me a lot more in the way that Nintendo designs stuff, in that it's appealing here to everybody.
No,
like, I feel like
but that's the point. Is when I say that they're suddenly starting to appeal to a younger demographic, it's not because there aren't games on PlayStation that are appealing to a younger demographic, but is that Sony's developed and published games appeal to a demographic that is not kids. And so suddenly, even if Astro is not I know you're not saying it should be this, but like a Peppa Pig, like Bluey style, like like a super simple thing, but appealing to all ages in the way that Mario is, that's really, really important to have a way for PlayStation's IP, characters, the games published by the studios to appeal to a younger demographic, at all ages, but as well as a younger demographic, to where they become ingratiated in PlayStation's identity from their studios. Of course, it's not really an issue, because there are plenty of kids accessible games on PlayStation, but not from their studios. And I think that, again, that's just a diversification thing of like, we want Astro to be a thing where kids can play it and love it, and also adults can play it and love it if they want to platinum or do the a die over and over again challenges. But I think they recognize that it's important, in the way that Nintendo has been able to build really, really strong, passionate, all ages fan bases, to have games that appeal to all ages fan bases, because they haven't for a long time.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because I've long wondered if PlayStation even cares. I've wondered if Xbox even cares. Yeah. Because I think there's a good argument to be made for the fact that, for as great as Astro Bot no doubt is going to be, when 3D Mario likely comes out next year, it's just going to beat the doors off of Astro Bot.
Absolutely.
I think that there's, to me, it also goes into a little bit of like, people are like, well, are like, Sony is just ceding the handheld market to Nintendo. They've given up. Yeah. Well, the reality is they wouldn't win even if they tried. No. And I'm not saying that defeatism is like a great way to arrange your studio, but I think that it's often
they come into work each day and they're like, all right, which things can we do without losing?
I just think it's often forgotten, particularly because we run in mostly Nintendo-centric circles, that PlayStation's history was never like Ape Escape. I mean, Ape Escape was big, but PlayStation was successful because it was the mature alternative to Nintendo 64. Yeah, totally. The big games of PlayStation were Metal Gear Solid 1, and they were Final Fantasy 7. Yeah. Sure, they were Crash Bandicoot, but even Crash Bandicoot was the mouthier, more edgy alternative to Mario. Yeah. And that's been the same for every generation of PlayStation ever. Yeah. So I think Astro Bot is interesting to me because he inhabits this space that, yes, is for everybody, but also with the PlayStation history angle, is pretty clearly trying to target people our age or older. Totally. Like, focusing on Parappa the Rapper costumes in this game does nothing for a kid who's like 7.
No, of course, yeah.
Now, the kids who are 7 will likely play Astro Bot and enjoy it, but I think that this game and its all ages appeal is, I want to say in some ways, foregrounding older fans that have this bed of nostalgia.
I agree in terms of where the people that are talking about this game the journalists, the YouTubers that are talking about this game are pretty heavily focused, and were for Astro's Playroom as well, on the PlayStation history aspect of it. We had a failed conversation last night about where does that balance in terms of Astro identity, and we can get a little more into that if you'd like. But I think that you're right, but you're only right from the perspective of you're in that group, and that's a part of what everyone around you is talking about. Because that's a big part of the game, but it's also still actually in reality in terms of development time and what the world is. It's still only like 15% of the game because it is a big, colorful world with funky characters that is a 3D platformer. That is the game, and that appeals to the younger audience. And then there's this veneer outside that is the PlayStation stuff, and it seems like that's being baked a little bit deeper into the gameplay identity of this game, and so we'll see how much that ends up pervading the entire design experience. But most of the design experience is a kid's thing, and then there's this also this.
I'm not sure
as well. But what do you mean? Like this game could exist without it, which means and it would be mostly the same.
No, but what I'm saying is, just as my perspective is influenced by the circles I'm in. Yeah, we are very far removed from what kids are actually playing.
Sure, no, that's true. Yeah,
the reality is that kids are playing Roblox, and they're playing Fortnite, and they're playing Baldi's Basics and Garten of Ban, and then Skibidi. I don't even know if there's Skibidi Toilet games.
Of course, there are, but not like.
So and this is again just another hypothesis of mine, but I feel like again, by the perspective that we have, we assume that a generation of kids wants what previous generations of kids wanted to play. Whereas young kids want big, colorful 3D platformers. When I think that there's a real chance that that's not actually what little kids want anymore. Yeah. They want these user-generated multiversal experiences. I mean, Roblox is run by kids, and it makes an enormous amount of money, and all of the cottage industries of content creation around these games are for kids. So I view Astro Bot as something that harkens back to a different era, but I think who it resonates with most strongly are not those kids.
I agree. No, I agree with you. Yeah. I think it's also it's also difficult to judge that because Astro's Playroom was a great game, but I don't necessarily know in terms of it being something that was mostly only relevant near the launch of PlayStation 5 and is a pack-in game, and do people really notice? Do people delete it? If that game was something that ever had the chance, because it wasn't marketed, to appeal to a younger demographic, I think that this is that litmus test. But I think it is. I think you are definitely right in that I liked colorful platforming games when I was a kid, and people 10 years older than me like colorful platforming games when they were kids. But do kids still like that? I think the chance is yes, because also they play a lot of just like jump around 3D platformers and Roblox, and so and they play Mario. Mario's still very popular with children. And they play Pokemon, and those are the things that have been sticking around relevant for kids generation to generation. I think the chance is yes, but I think you're also right in that this isn't made for kids in that same way, because if you want to make a game for kids, you make Roblox, or you make your game in Roblox, and then kids have access to it. That's really, if you want to actually grab that kids market without any shred of doubt, that's what you go do.
Yeah, and this is not me sort of disparaging what Astro is trying to do, because I generally think that the AAA 3D platformer is a genre that needs more games like this. Yeah. And so I'm very pleased about it. And
actually, interestingly enough, I will actually just quickly interject that I think also maybe part of the reason why 3D platformers might not be so appealing to kids these days is because kids these days haven't had 3D platformers to play. No one's really making them. I mean, Mario Odyssey, Crash 4, but kids probably aren't playing Crash 4.
No, I wouldn't say so.
So Astro...
It's really Mario Odyssey.
Yeah, so Astro might be... Astro and next year's Mario 3D platformer might be the way to get kids to like this kind of game again. Because these kind of games exist and are relevant to the kids because they're new. Which hasn't really been true for the last 10, 15 years other than Mario.
Yeah, and I was watching the Astro trailer a couple more times last night, because in the video we can't post, or we could post, but would have no sound, so you'd have to lip read it. My sound. I was true. I was quite critical, or I don't know if critical is the right word. I was very interrogatory of the idea that this game is really furthering Astro's identity. And I'm still unsure entirely, but in watching the trailer back a couple times, there's this interesting casino themed level, and there's some cool art direction in this like Japanese feudal inspired level, and there's this cool like pink trees and things. I still feel like it does look to just be, as I said yesterday, I feel like I can close my eyes and play Astro Bot right now.
Absolutely.
Because it's not stepping very far at all away from playroom or rescue mission. But I do have hope that, if they drop a 8-minute overview trailer or something close to release, and they show more items like Astro's dog friend or his frog gloves or whatever, it will become clear. Yeah, as the game's creative director, whoever was interviewed for Entertainment Weekly, said like that there is an emphasis being put here to give Astro's world more texture, and they did say, I believe, over 70 new unique enemies. So it's possible that this trailer's emphasis on the PlayStation stuff and emphasis on simply showing that there is an Astro game didn't really give us the opportunity to see all of the gimmicks, or a larger selection of the gimmicks it has in store, like the sponge ability and other things like that. Because even if you're not going to compete with Nintendo and win in attracting a family audience, because I don't think that if you're a family, you even go to PlayStation 5 over a Switch or a Switch 2 in the first place, I think that it's good to continue to represent your brand and have your catalog of experiences capture all various genres.
Exactly.
So
and that's really what I think is the catalyst of this entire conversation, of what makes this year interesting, why we're having this conversation, why I think maybe me more so than you, but are optimistic about this being something that can be taken into the future for the rest of this generation and hopefully past, is that I think they do realize that diversification is something that they've been sorely lacking, and the times that they have tried it, they've kind of half-assed it. I mean, Sackboy Big Adventure is a totally solid game, but they didn't put effort. They didn't put like marketing effort, like foreground it as the marquee title of its year, because it was surrounded by Ghost of Tsushima, Last of Us 2, Spider-Man, Miles Morales, Demon's Souls. It was in a year saturated with thing. Astro is probably the major release from them this year. Of course, Helldivers 2 in terms of sales, I don't think that Astro will pass that, but also those games are so far apart in terms of release that they can balance each other out. Astro seems to be the marquee title for them this year, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. I agree. And sort of the last thing I'll say on the topic is that, we had the quote from earlier in the year that they have no big IP games coming this year. And even though that obviously is referencing the lack of a big new Horizon or a God of War or whatever, I still think it paints these games in somewhat of an unfavorable light on accident.
Yeah, I agree.
And so it's not that I'm skeptical about PlayStation's future, because I think that there is literally a production level necessity to change how things are going. And I think these are the first stepping stones towards that new roadmap. I just wonder if Astro and Concord represent the new status quo, or if they represent just what Sony has to release until they iron out the playing field.
I think it's
but either way, the result are games I'm quite compelled to at least try. I will definitely try Concord with you, and I'm very, very excited. Despite my various reservations, I think I will love Astro Bot.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the sort of game that you just can't, like, it would be impossible for them to fuck it up.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, it's about them to screw it up because they've made 2 games like this and they've been really, really good. And so they're
exceptional.
There's
They're
just
both exceptional.
And also because, and you may, criticize the game or interrogated the game a little bit about this earlier, it looks very similar. And it's obviously based in the same engine. And they're not changing the physics too much. And so, we know they can do good level designs. So there's just no question about that. And I think that is pretty exciting in terms of one of the great things about, I think, the best developers is when you have faith in them. Is when you think about the next Zelda game, you're like, it's going to be Game of the Year. When you think about Rockstar, you're like, oh yeah, that's going to sell hundreds of millions of copies. Or From Software, even if it's totally new IP, you're like, yeah, it's going to be an amazing game. And I think that a lot of PlayStation studios have that. You're not concerned about the next Naughty Dog game. I mean, you might be able to just imagine what Horizon 3 is going to be, but it's not going to be a bad. There's no question that's going to be a great game. And I'm glad that Asobi is now entering in that echelon, because previously VR game that limits the niche, launch tech dome, very small game, only 4 or 5 hours. Can they handle a major game there were these questions, but I think after seeing the trailer for this and knowing that this is what they're working on, those questions I think have completely disappeared from my mind.
And the final point I wanted to raise, because you said you wouldn't worry about the next Naughty Dog game. Well, I did worry about the last Naughty Dog game because that was Factions, and I was right to worry about it because I canceled it. But I think Sony is quite aware that they shouldn't put themselves in that position again, because that just like graphic they shared of all their various teams delineates what types of games they make, and I think they have a very clear understanding of the fact that, look, this is what Naughty Dog should make, this is what Naughty Dog shouldn't make. And so even if it takes a while to get Firewalk feeling like they're on the level of or in the style of these other PlayStation games, at least on like a general philosophical sense, obviously not making the same games in the same style, I think that's a good sign that when things level out, there will be no reason at all to worry about Naughty Dog, because Naughty Dog will be allowed to just make their genre-defining action games once every 6 years, and these other teams pick up the slack for what Sony wants to explore otherwise.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, and I think that's what's exciting about the fact that they did make those acquisitions, and even though all these teams are unknown of what they can do, even something like Bluepoint, who has made great games, they haven't made an original game, and that seems to be what they're working on next. And so there's a little bit of hesitancy there, like, can they handle it? I have no idea.
Yeah.
But there are these questions because it's all new and because it's unknown. And I think that I have some solid faith in that things will turn out well, and that we'll be able to look back in a decade once we have 2 or 3 games from Firewalk and Haven, and Bluepoint has been doing their own original stuff, and the new IP that are the Last of Us style, Horizon style games from Santa Monica and Naughty Dog and Bend. If they have sequels, there will be this like, look where things started. Like, we were worried about that, and I think that I'm done here.
We're probably in the Uncharted 1 moment right now.
Exactly. No, exactly. Yeah. There's just the question mark. I'm like, oh, this is different. This is kind of strange. Who knows if it's going to turn out? But that's my exact point. Yeah.
We've got our Uncharted Fight for Fortune moment on the horizon then.
Concord Fight for Fortune. Astro. Ooh, what's another one like that? Run Astro what? Run. Mobile game.
Oh, great. That's a great pull.
Yeah.
Let's end it. What is that?
That's from Astro. That's the fucking GPU jungle.
GPU Jungle. Great name.
Actually, it's pronounced Gpoo. Gpoo Gungle.
Graphics Processing Unit Jungle.
That's his full legal name. When it has to, when GPU Jungle has to sign a legal document
or something.
I gotta write out the whole thing. Please call me Mr. Jungle. No, wait, no, Mr. Jungle. Mr. Jungle is my fault. I'm graphics processing unit.
Isn't it some kind of like serving
Cunt.
Yeah, but CPU.
Serving punt.
Well, we have until September to figure it out.
Astrobot serves cunt. CPU.
C parentheses P U N T.
Yes. God, that would look really, really awkward when it would be typed out. You're like, what the fuck? What do you? I don't understand. Because you don't.
And it's weird because it just rolls off the tongue when you say it.
Which part? Oh, yeah, with the parentheses. Oh, Lord.
All right. Do you want to do the intro, or do you want me to?
This one's for you, baby. I did a whole without your fucking permission, without your fucking assistance. I did a whole Concord video. That one came straight from my loins onto the internet.
Your head loins.
That's if you wrote a noise paper. If you wrote a noise paper, you'd have head loins. No more fun.
Clap
Stop.
sync.
This is fucking serious.
Clap sync. Okay, we're ready to go.
Yeah, that's something we usually do.